Hi, I'm Julie Brannon. I'm from Duke University. I'm an IT business analyst there, and I've been serving on the documentation work group for over 2 years, writing the documentation for acquisitions apps and the keyboard shortcuts, a few little miscellaneous apps. So the documentation working group is an open group for any volunteers from the various SIGs who want to participate and volunteer their time to construct the the docs.folio.org site. And I'm going to go ahead. The slide deck that we have for you today is going to walk us through kind of what is the working group, what is our historical timeline, what is our process for writing and publishing, kind of the scope of how it's changed from Honeysuckle to now, plans for localization, translation efforts, and then asking for folks to stay engaged and get involved. And feel free to jump into the Slack if you have, or not the Slack, but the chat for those who are online. If you want to ask a question, we have a small group of folks here in the room as well. So hopefully you can see this timeline that kind of lays out how long this group has been trying to write documentation. We published the first set with the Honeysuckle release, and I say with, but we didn't actually align it with the release because we were not yet to the point where we had documentation ready when the release was ready. So we were often playing catch up a month or two, or sometimes longer. So yeah, we release our documentation with the various folio releases, but if you're on the website, you might not be able to go all the way back. If I'm looking at Ian in the room. So you may not be able to go all the way back to Honeysuckle at this point, but you probably don't need to. You can, but why would you? I don't know that anyone is still on Honeysuckle. So when we got to Morning Glory, the little smiley face there, I think is because we were excited that we released the documentation at the same time that Folio released that software. And that was a big moment for the working group because it's a lot of work for us. And we'll probably talk about that in another slide, the process that we go through to get the documentation ready. I'm trying to remember. I don't know if I know how to advance. I don't want to mess up here.
I hope that will work.
Okay. Is it, you want me to keep going? I can.
You can
sure.
Both.
Yeah. So this slide, we were just trying to give a sense of the early days back in Honeysuckle. We were covering 12 core apps, and we've obviously had to extend that as the software has grown, and we're now covering 22 different apps. And so we have conversations about how the layout of the table of contents should look as things are growing and getting more complex. So for instance, for the reporting, we started out with just 2, and now we have 5 different sections of the documentation as of the Orchid release. Same with just kind of the getting to know folio. We didn't really have a lot of content in there, but now we have a platform essentials where you can read about perhaps things that aren't necessarily in the UI, like item status, but to give an explanation of concepts as well and kind of introducing people to the platform. So we have keyboard shortcuts, locations, permissions in the essentials. And maybe I'll hand it over at this point.
Yeah, Martina was going to say something about this one.
Oh,
if she is able to speak.
She is unmuted.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Can you
She has
hear me
unmuted
okay?
already.
Can you hear me okay?
But I don't know how we're going to hear her.
Okay, you can hear me on Zoom, yes, but not in the room.
Oh, they're hearing her on Zoom.
Oh,
okay.
Interesting.
Well, we could try. My laptop. It's a hybrid.
Can you hear me now? Hello,
We
everyone?
don't hear you here in the
Okay.
room, unfortunately. So sorry, Martina, but we can't hear you. And
Okay, I would try again.
Now we can hear you.
Oh, great. Perfect. So sorry for Zoom issues. And yeah, so I would like to tell you a little bit about our process, very briefly though. So directly after the last documentation release, we start with our preparation for the new documentation release, of course. And we have writers responsible for an area or a topic. Some are small, some are huge, like acquisitions, for example, is a huge one. And they need to find out what is new, what has changed between those releases, software releases, and what needs to be documented. And they are all representatives of their SIGs, for example, and they are talking to their POs and see what has changed. But of course, FOLIO is growing and there may be new areas and apps we need to consider for documentation. So we keep our ears and eyes open in various meetings, Slack, wiki pages, and then we try to get in contact with, for example, product owners or SIGs to find volunteers and people responsible for documentation. But of course, the first initial draft of a documentation is always taking a long time. So it might be that new apps and the documentation are a little bit postponed or delayed. And you saw Julie mentioned the timeline. We first started, and for example, to setting up all the pages and all the content, it takes a lot of time. So we do our best to include new areas and apps. And in October, there will be the Bugfest for the Poppy release. And this is 2 weeks of testing of the new release, community-wide, if you're not familiar with Bugfest. And we have a Bugfest environment, and this one has the functionality of the new Poppy release. So the scope of Poppy, which is for us as writers and the documentation working group very essential. Because if you go on Snapshot, you see not only the Poppy functionality, but much more sometimes. Maybe something for Quesnalia, which is already in Snapshot. So we are waiting for the Bugfest environment. And Julie gave us a hint in one of our documentation working group meetings, which I find very helpful. That she said that she compares the old environment from the older Bugfest with the new Bugfest installation to see what has changed, for example, in the interface of your app, for example, or in Julie's case, apps, I have to say. So, of course, creating the content for documentation is the task. So creating new sections, but also keeping up what has changed in the documentation. And some writers are seeking feedback from other writers or other groups, for example, the SIGs, or small groups for documentation with one area. And they sent out one representative to us, to the documentation working group. And we have our meetings, and we are talking about a lot of topics around documentation. But also the members help out with questions and issues which arose during writing or during content creation. And of course, then a final version is there. And we have a workflow via GitHub, where Ian Walls publishes the content to our documentation website. And of course, if it's published, then there will be a new next release coming up soon. So Quesnalia. So this is a brief overview of our process. So I would give back to Paul.
Thank you, Martina, for the overview. And now we go on with some plans we are doing right now for localization, because FOLIO is very international, and some countries or organizations in other countries have already translated the documentation, and now we are trying to have a scope or a proof of the concept, what it will be for work to translate the documentation or to have a localization of it. At the moment, we have the example of the German language we are used to in Germany, and we try now to conceptualize how the workflow could work. And at the moment, we look at the proof of concept with the application Localize. Localize has been already used for translation the UI, and now we see if it could work also with the documents we have already in English, and to have the translation maybe automatically, maybe half automatically in the Google Docs. So and the aim is to have the translation also in the same URL, that you can switch the language there and not have another website and all the workflow there. So that is some work we are doing right now. And yes, for the moment, we are also in need of some new subject matter experts, and want to share the opportunity here to get involved, or also to have some feedback for the current documentation and your view for it on it. There were some questions I think Christine and Katharina were doing. I'm not sure if they're attending the meeting right now. No, they're not. The idea was to make some kind of icebreaker questions, but I just go through it, so it's not so embarrassing because I don't know it. Yes, the glossary is huge, and it shows work and effort that is already been done. And there's one question. Good question. At the moment, it's not an obligation that I know of, but the community is willing to help out and give some guidance there. And the working group also want to share the idea of FOLIO, that we have a community that is open and transparent, and we hope that if you are contributing, that the contribution is for all of us, and so that we can collaborate better. And yes, but Stefan Dobek, you have any other questions about that? Great. Okay.
We have a question in the room.
Yeah, Harris.
I'm Lucy. Can we go to microphone?
Yeah, I think it's good.
Hello, I'm Lucy. I am a brand new member of the group. I'm on the consortia SIG, so I'm a liaison to this group, which is a little unnerving because there's like no consortia app right now, and so I'm still trying to figure out my way. I guess I have a question about sort of the target audience for documentation. Are you aiming it at? Are you writing for librarians, for the folks who will be implementing it technically on the back end? Does it depend on what module it is? Could you speak a little bit about sort of target audience and how you kind of define how to write for that audience?
Sure. Yeah, I could. So to this point, the documentation is really focused on the end user who's interacting with the UI exclusively. So I don't know that there's a lot for developers. I'm gesturing at Ian because now I'm thinking there are in some of the settings and configuration pieces, but
it's mostly the end user documentation. There are some sections like installing Folio
yes,
that are more centered around folks who would be doing that task, but a lot of the more technical documentation is still sort of living on dev.folio.org, and that I think is going to probably stay the same because we want to have those audiences let it be more focused instead of trying to have one pile of documentation that makes sense to every audience simultaneously. But of course, that's negotiable based on what people want to see and learn. So,
yeah. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Okay.
I have a related question, I guess.
Or I could just echo it back. Yeah.
So the other sort of complicating factor for us is we're going with EBSCO hosted Folio, which has its own set of documentation. If you could speak a little bit to sort of the tension between documentation for something like EBSCO and something that is more generic Folio, and how open is EBSCO to sort of borrowing from one or the other?
Yeah. So Lucy's question is about the interaction and the tension between documentation that vendors are providing to their clients and to this generic Folio. And I think that's a good topic, for discussion at a future working group meeting is sticking with the scope that's currently defined for this set of documents is very generic, out of the box Folio. And Ian is I'm encroaching.
I'm encroaching. I'm
yeah.
sorry.
I mean, we're definitely a discussion here today.
So I bring it up because I have this much pride about it. Because it was my only commit to Folio so far. The help icon in where it links from Folio to documentation is now configurable. So if you are a hosting provider, you could link out to your specific documentation, but we definitely want to have this is documentation for Folio. And you could easily take that. It's currently lives on GitHub. It's easy to spin up your own copy of that and then modify. So if you were adding additional apps or if you had some other context you wanted to provide using basically what the working group has provided as a base, and then in your local on a per tenant level, you can configure and say, okay, in this case, we're going to go off to this other URL. The idea was to provide flexibility for versioning. So you could, go to the Nolana docs versus the Orchid docs. But really you could just link to my example is always catsandsinks.com because that's really the best documentation site out there that I've ever seen.
We're getting an answer. Yes.
Yeah, Molly Driscoll has a comment in chat, and actually she's going to be picking up the acquisitions documentation because I'm rolling off of the group. So she's pointing out that from an EBSCO standpoint, we have training overview videos and interactive learning guides, but not our own documentation. Instead, the Folio documentation on EBSCO Connect is actually docs.folio.org indexed as a source. It routes you to that doc site when you click a result. And then we have another question. Do you plan to create official training materials for Folio, or is that rather not the job of the documentation group? Is that a question to Molly, or is that a question?
Yeah, maybe it's also referred to what style guide we are using. At the moment, we use a Google style guide for technical writing, and we provide, if you get in touch, some onboarding for that. So you know how to use it, which kind of stuff we are used to in the style, and what yeah, what the scope should be for your documentation. And we don't have material like PDFs or such anything else for that at the moment. Yeah, at the moment we have like onboarding talks and meetings. Yeah. Yeah. There's another question in the room. Thanks.
Hi all, it's Vivian from Mobius. So it does sound like the documentation really is a collective effort, both by the vendor provided and the community provided, which is really great, because if it were otherwise, I'm not sure I'd want to or be able to get involved. But if a person were to join the 16 people currently writing documentation, what is the average time commitment to document writing currently? And I know the answer probably is whenever you can, but having a good hourly average or median would be helpful.
Yeah, I can try that. Yeah, from an acquisition perspective, it was many hours per month at the beginning when we stood up the documents originally for Honeysuckle. It took a big chunk of time for all of us who did those initial, and we had interns from Missouri State who built, I mean, we had a collective effort, but now that it just depends on the release and how many features. So if the volunteer is already active in the SIG that's related to that area, that gives you a huge head start, because you have your ear to what's coming up in the next release, and you're probably pretty aware of the JIRA landscape for what's coming out in each release. But then it's a matter of taking the time to sit down and check the UI to see what's new and make the changes in the documents. That might be 4 or 6 hours one month, and it might be 15 or 20 another month. And I'm seeing a hand maybe sort of going up from Sharon.
Maybe once every couple of weeks, and then just figure out. So for individual, it might be, an hour, something, how much material, but it also so it doesn't. Once you, as she's saying, once you have your full set of materials, you're just looking for new features to talk about, or things to the leagues that have changed. So that's.
So Sharon was guesstimating for those online an hour a week, perhaps, for reporting, again, depending, give or take. Yeah.
But again, Vivian, there is no consortia specific
document yet.
all right now.
Right. There's still not a consortia.
Right. But we I don't think you get better. Give the online people the fact that even though my voice carries like crazy. I mean, we have, Mobius has really been working closely with EBSCO on the development work. So I imagine if theoretically I were to join y'all, I suspect I'd probably be writing on that topic. But as has been pointed out, we are mid-implementation, and so my time availability is kind of, limited anyway. Once we're live, who knows? But yeah, you're right. There is no documentation for ECS, but I think we at Mobius are probably in the best position to start creating.
Yes, and I would. So I'm on the consortia SIG, so they asked for volunteers. So I volunteered because we're going to be in the same situation that you are in a year from now. But you are ahead of us. So if you want to join forces here and do this,
yeah, we're paving the way. Yeah, but yes, I certainly am personally unwilling to make a deep commitment to anything at this point, but I definitely like it.
Okay. Good. Are there any other perspective on the documentation you want to share? Like, do you have seen something you want to talk about or share? Also online.
Were you going to share like the template or whatever for how documentation is meant to be in the agenda at the top of the session that said something about there is a template used, or there is a structure used for the creation of documentation. I'm curious to see what that is, if it exists.
I'm approaching to you.
Oh boy.
Okay. So documentation. Oh yes. Just in case the audio doesn't carry, because I'm scattered all over the place. Templates for creating documentation. We have our style guide as a component. We have everything is written in Markdown, so it's relatively straightforward to do this sort of the heading structure. There is not at this time a template file like add new page to documentation kind of structure. What I did when I was contributing the little bit of content that I provided was look at basically what another chapter looked like, and like, okay, keyboard shortcuts and permissions are sort of key sections at the top, kept that, and then walk through sort of the, oh yeah, this is how you create, this is how you edit, this is how you delete different sections. But as far as a fillable template, I don't think we have one of those, probably because each section has enough differences that it would be difficult to have that in place.
So I can talk a little bit about kind of activity. So how we do it is we have a small group out of the reporting SIG. We start in Google Docs and create the content, and then we convert that to Markdown, and then it's uploaded. It's just easier, so we're not having to fiddle with the Markdown as we're deciding what is it actually going to say. That's just one way to do it. So you can go directly to Markdown, or you can start in Google Docs and then take that over to Markdown.
So does Markdown dictate like the style of the, like a CSS or something? It dictates how the actual text appears in the documentation. So that wouldn't be a thing that a person would need to worry about necessarily. We just need to know how to reformat whatever the documentation is in Markdown.
I'm sure that we just figured it out based on files that were already there, so just copy, okay, how do they use headings and subheadings, and yeah.
And that ergonomic affordance for folks that are doing document creation in Google, there is a plugin that will convert a Google Doc into Markdown format, because it's headings and lists. This is fairly well understood structure. It's just a different way of marking it up. Instead of HTML, it's Markdown. So there's tools to help with that. The trick, at least in my experience, is links. Because getting link syntax between pages, there's just a little bit of peculiarity between Markdown and the templating engine that actually renders the Markdown into a web page that you can view. That's handled by, I don't want to call it a full CI/CD process, but there's automations there. What happened? We update GitHub, and then that kicks off actions to generate the updated pages in Amazon.
And Molly's making a point. I don't know that.
Molly says, editing in GitHub also shows you pretty easily if you've made a mistake, not that I'm constantly messing up the Markdown or anything. Yes, so it is possible. So you can approach from the Google Drive, Google Docs sort of setup. You can fork a repo and edit in your favorite local text editor on your machine, and then manage the Git parts yourself. You can also edit directly in GitHub and have that turn into a pull request for being able to do content. I find that's pretty helpful for like smaller changes, but if you're gonna really like sit down and write like a whole new section or entire new page, probably better to have a more robust editor than that. I give this mic to somebody else, please.
Yeah, this is Julie again. So we're sharing on screen a link to a page that Aaron Netafee created for us recently that kind of just brings together, if you're new to the working group, some resources on how to find the guidelines and a bit about Markdown and so forth. So that's, thank you, Erin.
Thank you, Erin.
Thank you, Erin. Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah, wow. Thank you for the discussion and your questions. It feels like there are no any questions, any further questions? Maybe online? No, but I will give some time to react. Okay, then thank you so much for helping out and for listening and also the discussion. And I look forward to have new stuff in the documentation with you and get involved more and see you in the next, hopefully next working group documentation or not, Julie. And thank you for your effort. Okay, have a great day. Bye.